3:17 in the snow. At 3:17 in the morning on January 12, 1942, somewhere west of Moscow near the frozen approaches to Istra Verify, a Soviet medical orderly from a rifle company of the 20th Army Verify was lying flat in the snow with a rope wrapped twice around his wrist. The rope was not thick. It was not clean. It had frozen hard in places where blood and water had worked into the fibers. Every time he pulled, it scraped against his sleeve and bit through the wool beneath. Behind him, half hidden in a shallow fold of white ground, a wooden sled moved a few inches at a time. On it lay a wounded rifleman. The man's name is not recorded here. That is how most men entered moments like this. Not as names in a book. Not as faces in a monument. Just weight, breath, blood under a greatcoat, a boot heel dragging to one side because the leg below it no longer obeyed him. The orderly could hear him sometimes. Not words, only a low sound, broken by the cold. Ahead, German machine guns searched the darkness. They were not firing continuously. That would almost have been easier. The silence between bursts made every movement feel louder. A runner scraping over crusted snow. A metal buckle knocking against wood. A man breathing too sharply through his teeth. The first burst went high. The second burst struck somewhere to the right, chopping into the frozen surface with a flat, ugly rhythm. The orderly stopped pulling. For a moment, nothing moved except the steam from his mouth. The wounded soldier on the sled lifted one hand and let it fall again. It landed against the sideboard with a dull tap. That sound stayed with the orderly longer than the gunfire. A glove against wood. A man asking without words whether they were still moving. Behind them, the Soviet trench line was close enough to imagine and too far to feel safe. A field aid point waited beyond it, dug into the earth, roofed with logs and snow, lit by one weak lamp that made every face look older than it was. If the wounded man reached that place, someone could cut away the frozen cloth, check the bleeding, tighten a bandage, inject what medicine was available, and decide whether he could be moved farther back. If he did not reach it soon, the snow would do what the bullet had not finished. That was the part the maps did not show. On paper, armies moved wounded men through systems, battalion aid stations, regimental medical points, divisional medical sanitary battalions, evacuation hospitals, rear hospitals. The lines seemed rational when drawn in pencil. They seemed almost reassuring. A man was wounded here. He was moved there. He was treated, sorted, transported, recorded. But the first distance was not a line. It was a field under fire. It was snow deep enough to swallow boots. It was darkness. It was panic held down under discipline. It was one man trying not to stand up because standing up meant becoming a target, and another man tied to a cheap sled because there was no other way to move him. The sled itself looked like nothing. Rough runners, crossboards, rope, something a village carpenter could have made before sunrise. It had no engine, no armor, no medical insignia painted proudly on its side. It was not one of the machines that filled wartime newsreels. No general would point to it on a map. No enemy commander would write a fearful report about it. And yet, in that hour, in that snow, it mattered more than almost anything else. The orderly pulled again. The sled came forward. A few inches. Then more. The runners hissed softly over the crust, then sank, then lifted. The wounded man made the same low sound as before. The orderly did not look back. Looking back cost time. And time was the one thing the cold never returned. He believed, as many men did at the front, that courage was not a grand feeling. It was often just the next pull of a rope, the next crawl, the next few meters before the gunner saw you. The German machine gun fired again. This time the bullets passed low enough for the orderly to feel snow strike the back of his neck. He pressed his face down until his mouth filled with ice crystals. His fingers tightened around the rope. He waited. 3 seconds. 5, 10. Then he pulled. The sled moved. The wounded man was still alive. For now. And in that small movement, almost invisible beneath the scale of the Eastern Front, there was a truth few people behind the lines understood. The fate of a wounded soldier was not decided only in hospitals. It was not decided only by surgeons, ambulances, or official medical plans. Sometimes it was decided by rough wood and rope. Sometimes it was decided by whether a man could be dragged through snow before his blood cooled beneath his coat. And to understand why that cheap wooden sled became a quiet instrument of survival, we have to leave the frozen field for a moment and look at the war as commanders preferred to see it. From above, on paper, where everything still seemed to move. The war on paper. In headquarters, the war had shape. Even when the front was collapsing, advancing, bending, or freezing in place, staff officers tried to give it shape. Roads became lines. Units became symbols. Casualties became numbers written in columns. Supply routes were traced in pencil. Medical evacuation routes were drawn backward from the front, as if suffering itself could be organized by arrows. This was not stupidity. An army could not function without systems. The Red Army, like every great wartime institution, needed order because the scale of the killing was too large for memory alone. A wounded man had to be found, treated, sorted, transported, and either returned to duty or moved deeper into the medical chain. Without structure, the wounded vanished into mud, snow, panic, and rumor. The Soviet system of stage treatment had logic. First came help on the battlefield. Self-aid, help from a comrade, or the work of a medical orderly. Then the wounded were taken to battalion aid stations, then to regimental medical aid points, where triage, pain relief, bandage correction, and stabilization could begin. From there, more serious cases could move to divisional medical sanitary battalions, and then farther back if they survived the journey. On a chart, this looked like a chain. At the front, it felt more like a series of bets. The first bet was whether anyone could reach you. The second was whether they could move you. The third was whether the route back still existed. In summer, mud could swallow wheels. In autumn, roads disappeared into brown paste. But winter brought its own deception. Snow made the battlefield look cleaner than it was. It covered broken branches, shell holes, dead horses, mines, abandoned equipment, and bodies. It softened the edges of ruin. From a distance, a battlefield after snowfall could look almost peaceful. Then a man tried to cross it carrying another man, and the illusion ended. A stretcher was a sensible tool. 2 poles, canvas, for hands if you had them, 2 if you had no choice. But deep snow changed the mathematics of effort. Each bearer sank differently. Each step jolted the wounded man. A man with a stomach wound could cry out from a shift of weight. A man with a shattered thigh could lose blood faster if carried badly. A man with frost forming on his eyelashes might not have the strength to survive a slow, uneven carry. Wheeled carts did not solve the problem. Wheels belonged to roads, and roads near the front were often broken, blocked, shelled, or buried. Trucks were precious. Fuel was precious. Engines hated cold. Tires sank. Drivers needed orders. Vehicles made noise, and noise invited attention. Horses were valuable too, but horses ate, panicked, froze, were wounded, and died. In many sectors they were already overworked by ammunition, food, and supply duties. A commander might want them for evacuation. A quartermaster might need them for shells. A battery commander might argue that without horses his guns could not move at all. The wounded man had no vote in these arguments. He waited where he fell. This was the hidden problem inside the official map. The system was real, but it began only after the front allowed it to begin. The first stretch, from shell crater to cover, from open ground to trench, from trench to aid post, remained dangerously personal. Could not be solved by a chart. It had to be solved by exhausted men and women doing the work with whatever they had. Some had stretchers. Some had blankets. Some had doors pulled from ruined houses. Some had skis. And sometimes, in the snow, they had sleds. A sled did not make the system unnecessary. It made the system reachable. It connected the wounded man to the first step of the chain. It was small enough to be ignored by high command and simple enough to appear wherever soldiers could find wood. That is why it mattered. Not because it replaced doctors. Because it bought time for doctors to matter. Still, in the early hours of a rescue, nobody spoke in those terms. No orderly lying in the snow thought of medical doctrine. No wounded man listened for the sound of a divisional medical sanitary battalion. They listened for boots, for a voice, for the scrape of something moving toward them. The war on paper believed the wounded moved through stages. The war in the snow revealed something harsher. Before a wounded man could enter the system, someone had to drag him into reach of it. And the first 100 meters could be the cruelest distance in the entire war. The first 100 meters. The first 100 meters did not look important on a map. Could be crossed by a pencil stroke. A staff officer could draw it without slowing his hand. A commander could glance at it and think of it only as the space between positions, a shallow belt of broken ground before the next trench or tree line. But to a wounded man, those 100 meters could become a country of their own. There was terrain inside them, shell holes filled with powdery snow, a torn telephone cable stiff as wire, a frozen patch where blood had already glazed the surface dark, splintered fence posts, a dead horse lying under a white covering with one leg still visible, rifle flashes far enough away to look small and close enough to kill. The first 100 meters were where rescue became visible to the enemy. A medical orderly could move inside a trench with some protection. A doctor could work in a dugout beneath logs. A truck could wait behind a ruined village. But the man lying between lines was beyond all of that. To reach him, someone had to cross the place where nobody wanted to stand. Often, the wounded were not neatly located. A man could crawl after being hit and disappear behind a snowdrift. Another could fall into a shell crater and be hidden from his own side. A third might be heard only when the wind dropped. At night, rescuers moved by sound. A cough, a groan, the faint calling of a name. Sometimes they found Germans. Sometimes Germans found them. The war did not pause for medicine. The Red Cross on an armband might mean something behind the lines. Under artillery fire, at night, through blowing snow, it could mean very little. Men shot at movement. They shot at shadows. They fired because they were afraid, because they were ordered to, because a shape rose where no shape should be. This is where a stretcher became both necessary and dangerous. To lift a man onto a stretcher, bearers had to gather around him. They had to raise him high enough to carry. In deep snow, their steps fell unevenly. One man stumbled. The stretcher tilted. The wounded man cried out, and sound carried. If the bearers tried to crouch, the weight punished their backs. If they stood, their silhouettes rose. A sled changed the profile of the rescue, kept the wounded man low. It let the bearers crawl, kneel, or stoop. It reduced the number of hands needed for movement. It spread weight across snow instead of forcing 4 boots to punch through crust again and again. It allowed a wounded body to slide where carrying would have been impossible or too slow. It was not gentle. A sled could jolt, could catch on roots, could tip into a shell hole. It could scrape across frozen clods and make a man with broken bones bite through his own sleeve to keep from crying out. No one who used it would confuse it with comfort. But comfort was not the measure. Movement was. There are tools in war that matter because they are powerful. A heavy gun matters because it can break a position. A tank matters because it can cross ground under fire. A radio matters because it allows command to travel faster than a runner. The wooden sled mattered because it reduced one problem to the size of human endurance. One man could pull. 2 could guide. A third could cover them. The wounded man, wrapped in a blanket or greatcoat, could be secured with rope and moved without being lifted every few steps. In the right snow, on the right ground, at the right hour, that was enough. And enough was everything. Think of the cold not as weather, but as a clock. Every minute after a wound changed the body. Blood loss weakened the pulse. Shock narrowed the world. Hands stopped obeying. Speech came slower. Wet cloth froze. A man who might have survived the wound could die from waiting too long in a place where no one could reach him. The sled did not stop bleeding. It did not remove shrapnel. It did not cure shock. It did one thing: it turned waiting into motion. That is why the people closest to the wounded understood it before anyone else. A senior officer could believe evacuation began when casualties reached the aid post. A medic knew evacuation began the moment he crawled out with a rope in his hand. And these were the people who saw the hidden shape of the front. Not the line of advance. Not the enemy's tactical intention. The shape of suffering. Where men fell. Which routes were exposed. Which snowbanks gave cover. Which stretch of ground always cost another rescuer. Which wounded could be carried. Which had to be dragged. Which would still be alive if reached before dawn. They were not writing doctrine. They were learning under fire. And from that learning came the quiet authority of the underdog. The orderlies, nurses, felchers, and stretcher-bearers who rarely appeared in the great histories of campaigns but who knew, in their hands and backs, what the front was really asking of them. The orderlies nobody counted. The men and women who brought the wounded back were often recorded as medical personnel, orderlies, nurses, stretcher-bearers, felchers, or simply attached sanitary staff. The battlefield gave them other names. The one who crawled out. The one who came back twice. The one who knew where the wounded were. The one who did not leave you. They were not always trained the way later generations imagine combat medics to be trained. Some were experienced. Some learned quickly because the front allowed no slower education. Some had bandages, scissors, splints, iodine, tourniquets, a medical satchel, and whatever pain relief could be found. Others had almost nothing except their hands and the habit of moving toward voices other men moved away from. Many were young. Some were women barely older than the soldiers they dragged back. Soviet women served in many frontline medical roles, and some became known for bringing dozens, even hundreds, of wounded men from the battlefield over the course of the war. Verify specific examples before naming. But fame came only to a few. Most remained folded into unit records, award citations, or family memory. The work was less dramatic than people imagine and more terrible because of that. A rescuer did not usually run through explosions with music rising behind him. He crawled. He waited. He cursed under his breath when a knot froze. He pressed his body into the snow until his ribs hurt. He listened. He learned the difference between a man calling in panic and a man whose voice had become dangerously calm. He also learned triage before he had the language for it. One man could be saved if moved now. Another would die even if carried first. A third was quiet, and quiet could mean unconscious, dead, or too cold to speak. These were not noble choices. They were choices made with dirty hands in bad light. The rescuer might remember them later, but the battlefield did not give him time to justify them. To commanders, medical personnel were part of the support structure. Necessary, certainly. Brave, often. But not the force that decided a battle. At the front, that distinction blurred. A company that believed its wounded would be recovered could hold itself differently. A soldier did not want to think about being hit, but every soldier thought about it. He saw who was carried back and who remained in the snow. He saw whether the medics came. He saw whether the army still had enough humanity left to risk living men for wounded ones. That mattered. Not in speeches. In the private arithmetic of fear. The orderlies saw this. They also saw the failures that others missed. A stretcher team might be brave and still too slow. A horse team might be ordered and still never arrive. A truck might be available behind the line and useless at the crater where the man lay bleeding. The problem was not always courage. Often it was friction. Too much weight. Too much snow. Too few hands. Too little time. The sled answered friction. That was its genius, though the people using it did not call it that. They called it practical. They called it necessary. They called it the thing left to try. A cheap wooden sled could be made close to the front. It could be repaired with nails, wire, rope, or a strip of torn leather. It could be stored beside a trench wall under branches behind a ruined shed. It did not need gasoline. It did not require a road. It could be pulled by soldiers on foot, by ski troops, by dogs in some sectors, by horses when available. Archival images show wounded Soviet soldiers being transported by dog sled in the USSR during the winter of 1942. A small visual reminder that snow itself forced armies to adapt their methods of evacuation. But the most important thing about the sled was not its construction. It was where it placed control. A vehicle had to be assigned. A horse had to be available. A road had to exist. A sled could be taken by the people who needed it and used at once. That kind of simplicity can look unimpressive from far away. It does not satisfy the imagination like a tank charge or a bomber raid. It does not make history feel large. Yet war is often decided by what keeps working after the impressive things fail. A medic did not need the sled to be admired. He needed it to move. And so, somewhere in the snow, someone tied rope to wood, tested the runners with one boot, looked toward the open ground, and made a decision that no headquarters could make for him. The idea seemed too crude for modern war. Then the shelling began, and crude became exactly what survival required. A ridiculous tool for a modern war. By 1942, the Eastern Front had become a place of machines. Tanks ground through villages and died in ditches. Artillery batteries fired until their barrels were hot, then froze again in the night air. Trucks carried ammunition over roads that were roads only because men insisted on calling them that. Aircraft passed overhead in weather that made engines cough and ground crews suffer. Modern war had weight. Steel, fuel, rubber, radio sets, spare parts, shell crates, bridge sections, field kitchens, machine tools. Every army wanted more of these things. Every commander understood that industrial power mattered. Even when men spoke of courage, they counted guns. Against that world, a wooden sled looked almost embarrassing. It belonged to peasant winters, to village lanes, to children carrying firewood, to hunters moving through forests. It had no glamour, no secret technology, no manufacturer's promise, no doctrine that made it sound important. It was wood bent or cut into runners, boards across the top, rope through the front, sometimes a blanket, sometimes a strap, sometimes nothing but whatever could be found. A ridiculous thing, until a truck could not get forward, until stretcher bearers were sinking to their knees, until a horse team was needed for ammunition, until the man in the snow had 10 minutes left. Then the ridiculous thing became the most sensible object in the sector. That is the strange honesty of war. It strips tools of reputation and judges them only by whether they work. A beautiful machine that cannot start in the cold is useless. A carefully planned road that disappears under shellfire is a line on paper. A medical evacuation procedure that cannot reach the wounded man is compassion delayed until it becomes meaningless. The sled had advantages that did not look like advantages in a parade. It was silent or nearly silent, could move low. It did not frighten easily, as horses did. It did not drink fuel. It did not require a driver trained on a specific vehicle. Could be abandoned if necessary. If broken, it could be repaired by men who had never seen a factory blueprint. If lost, another could be made. Above all, it matched the ground. That is the thing that mattered. The winter front did not care what an army preferred. Cared what could cross snow. Wheels concentrated weight and sank. Boots broke crust and punished legs. A sled spread weight and slid. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough. There may have been officers who saw sleds as stopgap measures, as signs of poverty, improvisation, or emergency. They would not have been entirely wrong. The Red Army endured shortages, chaos, and enormous pressures. Improvisation was often born from necessity, not abundance. But necessity has a way of discovering truths that comfort misses. The cheap sled did not represent backwardness. In the right environment, it represented adaptation. It was a tool shaped by winter rather than by pride. A modern army could afford to mock that only until its own wounded began freezing where vehicles could not reach them. The Germans understood winter transport too in their own ways. They used sledges, skis, horses, and improvised methods when conditions demanded it. Verify comparative German practices. No army on the Eastern Front was exempt from the land itself. But Soviet forces, fighting across their own winter terrain, often had local knowledge, civilian habits, and hard-won practical experience that made such tools more natural to use. This was not mythology. The cold punished Soviet soldiers as well. Their uniforms did not make them immune. Their boots did not cancel frostbite. Their medics did not float over snow. They suffered, stumbled, froze, bled, and died like other men. But preparation and adaptation changed what suffering allowed. A sled was preparation in its simplest form. A board against paralysis. A rope against delay. A low, quiet answer to the question nobody in headquarters could avoid forever. How do you move a wounded man when the battlefield refuses to let you carry him? And the answer could only be proven one way. Not in a manual. Not in a meeting. Under fire. The test under fire. The attack had ended badly before anyone called it that. At first, there had been movement. Men going forward in short lines through the trees, hunched under packs, rifles wrapped in cloth where possible to keep the metal from biting skin. Artillery had fallen somewhere ahead. Not enough to silence everything. Enough to shake snow from branches and make men believe, briefly, that the enemy was pinned. Then came the machine gun. A short burst at first. Then another. Then the longer tearing sound that made everyone lower themselves at once. The company broke into the ground as if the snow had pulled it down. Men found depressions, shell holes, ditch lines, the lee side of broken fences. Orders moved badly. A whistle sounded once and was not repeated. Somewhere to the left, a man shouted for a medic, then shouted the same word again, much softer. By dawn, the attack had not become a breakthrough. It had become scattered positions, wounded men, and a line that neither side fully owned. That was when the sled came forward. Not boldly, not openly. It was dragged up behind a shallow trench by two orderlies and a rifleman whose own face was gray from lack of sleep. The sled had been used before. One runner showed a crack repaired with wire. The boards were stained in places where snow had not washed them clean. A folded blanket lay across it, stiff at the edges. They waited for wind. That was not poetry. Wind covered sound. When it came hard enough across the field, it carried loose snow sideways and made everything harder to see. The German position ahead became a darker line behind drifting white. The orderlies looked at each other, then at the shallow ground where the wounded man lay. No speech was needed. One man took the rope. The other pushed the sled from behind. The rifleman stayed slightly back with his weapon ready, though ready meant very little when the enemy was a shadow behind trees. They went low. The first 20 meters were easy enough to deceive them. The sled slid cleanly over crusted snow. The rope held. The wounded man's position seemed closer. Then the ground dipped, and one runner caught on something buried beneath the surface. A branch. A frozen root. A piece of equipment. The sled turned sideways. The man with the rope stopped too late. The sled tilted. The wounded soldier made a sound that seemed to rise from somewhere below his lungs. The orderly behind the sled froze. Not from cold. From the fear of having hurt him worse. Then the machine gun fired again. Snow jumped in a line behind them. The man with the rope dropped flat and pulled the sled by instinct. The rear orderly fell across the wounded man, using his own body to keep him from rolling off. For several seconds, nothing made sense. There was only snow in the mouth, the snap of bullets, the wounded soldier's breath, and the absurd thought that the blanket might come loose. When the firing stopped, the rear orderly lifted his head first. The wounded man was still on the sled. The rope was still tied. They were still alive. So they moved, not in a heroic rush, in pieces. Pull. Stop. Listen. Pull again. Shift the sled around a crater. Untangle rope from a boot. Press a hand against the wounded man's chest to check that he was breathing. Pull again. Halfway back, the man at the rope lost his right mitten. He did not notice at first. His hand had already become clumsy. The rope had burned a wet groove across his palm, and then the cold took over. He realized the mitten was gone only when his fingers stopped closing properly. He tried to tuck them into his sleeve and pull with his left. The sled slowed. The rear orderly came forward, took the rope beside him, and they pulled together. That was the mathematics of the sled in its rawest form. It did not eliminate effort. It redistributed it. It allowed men who were nearly finished to keep moving a load that would have been impossible to carry upright. It turned a wounded body from something lifted into something drawn. The trench edge appeared suddenly. A dark cut in the snow. Hands reached out from below. Someone whispered too loudly. Someone else cursed at him to be quiet. The sled came down awkwardly, almost tipping again as it crossed the lip of the trench. The wounded man slid, was caught, and then was lifted by 4 hands into the narrow passage. Only then did he speak. Not a speech. Not gratitude shaped for memory. Just 2 words. Still here. The men around him heard it and looked away, because sometimes relief was harder to show than fear. Inside the aid dugout, the air was sour with smoke, iodine, damp wool, blood, and human breath. A lamp threw shadows across the ceiling logs. A medical worker cut at frozen cloth. Someone asked where the bleeding was worst. Someone else tightened a bandage that had stiffened almost solid. Outside, the sled was turned around. There were more wounded still in the field. One rescue had worked. That was not the same as victory. It was only proof that the idea could survive contact with the front. And once an idea survives under fire, it begins to spread, not as a theory but as a habit. If one sled could bring back one man, what could many sleds do across a winter front where thousands were falling into snow? The mathematics of survival. War often turns human beings into numbers. Rounds fired, kilometers gained, tanks lost, men missing, men wounded, men fit for duty, men evacuated. The numbers are necessary. Without them, no army can understand itself. But every number hides a body. Every category hides a decision. And somewhere between the battlefield and the aid station, survival becomes a matter of minutes that no report can fully explain. A wounded man in winter faced more than the wound. Blood loss was one danger. Shock another. Exposure another. Wet clothing could become rigid. A man who had fallen hot from exertion might begin to freeze as soon as he stopped moving. Hands that could still grip a rifle 10 minutes earlier might lose feeling. Speech could become confused. A soldier who looked conscious when first found might fade before reaching help. This is why speed mattered. Not speed in the sense of a tank advance. A quieter speed. The speed of getting a bandage corrected before bleeding worsened. The speed of getting a man under cover before shell fragments found him again. The speed of moving him to a place where someone could decide whether he needed surgery, warmth, transport, or simply a chance to stop losing blood. A stretcher team might need 2 men. Often for if the ground was hard and the load heavy. In winter clothing, a wounded soldier could become a difficult weight. Body, boots, greatcoat, equipment, frozen fabric, and the awkwardness of injury. If the snow was deep, the bearers were not only carrying him. They were fighting the ground with every step. The sled reduced that penalty. It did not make weight disappear. It changed how the weight met the earth. Instead of lifting the man fully, rescuers pulled him. Instead of having 4 men exposed upright, 1 or 2 might move lower. Instead of every step jolting unevenly through snow, the load could slide roughly, imperfectly, but with less vertical strain. What matters is not an exact number carved into certainty. Reports and local conditions varied too much for that. What matters is the relationship. If a sled saved even a few minutes on one evacuation, those minutes might matter to 1 man. If it saved those minutes again and again across a company sector, it mattered to many. If it allowed fewer bearers to move more wounded, it mattered to the unit. If it allowed rescues that would otherwise have been abandoned until daylight, it mattered to morale. And if morale held even slightly longer under the belief that the wounded would not simply be left in the snow, it mattered to combat power. This is the part of war that rarely fits cleanly into popular memory. A weapon kills the enemy and becomes visible. A tool that keeps your own men alive often disappears into logistics. It does not produce dramatic before and after photographs. It produces absences. The absence of a frozen corpse in the morning, the absence of a name on a missing list, the absence of a mother receiving one kind of letter instead of another. The wooden sled belonged to that category. Its value was measured in friction removed. 1 less lift. 1 less stumble. 1 less exposed silhouette. 1 less minute in the open. In a hospital, medicine can look like skill. A surgeon's hand, a clean instrument, a diagnosis made quickly. At the front, before any of that, medicine could look like rope. The first stage of Red Army battlefield care began with self-aid, aid from comrades, or a medical orderly on the battlefield. Only after that could a wounded man move deeper into the system. This means the most fragile part of survival was often the earliest part, before proper treatment, before transport records, before rear area order returned. The sled lived in that fragile space. It was not impressive enough to become a symbol. It was too useful to ignore. Still, the numbers do not tell the whole truth. They cannot tell us what it cost the people who pulled. Because every minute saved for a wounded man had to be purchased by someone else's strength, someone else's exposure, someone else's willingness to go back out after already surviving once. And that price was paid in silence, trip after trip, until the sled itself began to carry more than bodies. Carried memory. The price paid by the pullers. The sled came back different each time. A little more snow packed beneath the runners. A new tear in the blanket. A darker stain near the centerboard. A rope pulled tighter, then loosened by hands too tired to untie it properly. No one had to say where it had been. Everyone knew. In a forward aid post, objects take on meaning quickly. A lamp means someone is still working. A kettle means warmth is possible. A stack of bandages means the night has not yet outrun supply. A sled outside the entrance means the line between battlefield and shelter is still open. For the wounded, that could be hope. For the people who pulled it, it could become a burden almost too heavy to name. The first trip might be powered by urgency. A man is calling. You go. The second trip is harder because you know the ground now. You know where the machine gun can reach. You know the sound bullets make when they hit packed snow. You know how badly the sled tilts at the crater near the broken fence. The third trip is worse because fear has had time to become intelligent. The body begins to count what the mind tries to suppress. Thighs burning from crouched movement. Shoulders tight from pulling. Fingers swollen and numb. Eyes watering from cold wind. A mouth so dry that even snow cannot seem to wet it. The wounded are not always easy to move. A man with a chest wound may panic when laid flat. A man with a shattered leg may beg to be left alone the moment the sled begins to move. A man half-conscious may claw at the rope, not understanding that it is meant to save him. A man already dying may be placed on the sled because nobody can be certain he is beyond saving, and because certainty is a luxury the front rarely grants. Then there are the choices. 1 sled, 2 wounded men, 3 voices. A medic has to decide who moves first. He might choose the man bleeding most visibly, and later realize another man was colder, quieter, closer to death. He might choose the man who can survive the journey, not the one who cries loudest. He might leave morphine for one and bandage another. He might tell a soldier, "We'll come back," and know as he says it that the sentence is a promise made against artillery, weather, enemy fire, and exhaustion. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes the man was no longer there. Sometimes he was there and no longer needed help. This is where courage loses its clean edges. It is easy, from far away, to speak of bravery as if it were a shining thing. At the front, bravery could feel like guilt arranged into motion. You went because someone was calling. You went because you had gone before. You went because if you stopped, you would hear the voices anyway. The sled made that going possible. It also made it repeatable. A stretcher team might collapse after 1 or 2 carries through deep snow. A sled could let them continue. That was its gift and its cruelty. The easier tool allowed more work. More work meant more exposure. More exposure meant the rescuers themselves became casualties. A medical orderly killed while pulling a wounded man did not make the sled a failure. It made the arithmetic even darker. The tool saved strength, not life itself. It widened the margin, but the front could still close it without warning. Inside the aid post, medical workers saw the results. They saw men arrive who would not have arrived otherwise. They also saw the condition in which they arrived. Half frozen, bandages stiff, wounds contaminated by snow, faces gray with shock. The sled could shorten the distance, could not erase what the distance had done. A nurse might cut away clothing and find that the soldier's blood had frozen fabric to skin. A feldsher might look at a tourniquet and wonder how long it had been in place. A doctor might decide, in a few seconds, whether a man could survive further transport or needed urgent treatment where he lay. Behind each decision was the same hidden question. How long was he out there? The sled answered by arriving. Sometimes soon enough. Sometimes not. And when official reports later spoke of evacuation, transport, casualty handling, or winter medical arrangements, they often flattened these moments into administrative language. Necessary language. Useful language. But language that could not hold the sound of a glove tapping against wood in the dark. Recognition would come slowly, if it came at all. The sled would be seen through results, not reverence. And that is how many life-saving things pass through war. Used constantly, remembered rarely, and understood only after the snow has already covered the tracks. Reports after the snow. After battle, paperwork begins. Not immediately. First come the missing, the wounded, the dead, the ammunition counts, the orders to move, the orders to hold, the questions no one wants to answer too directly. Then, when the line steadies enough for writing, the war returns to paper. Reports are necessary because memory is too fragile and armies too large. But reports also change the texture of experience. A night of crawling through snow becomes evacuation under difficult conditions. A man dragged on a sled becomes wounded transported to aid point. A failed rescue becomes casualty remained forward until morning. A medical orderly who made 6 trips may appear only as a name attached to an award recommendation, if that. The language is cold because it has to be. No army can write every wound as a tragedy. Still, somewhere in those reports, the truth began to surface. Winter evacuation required special measures. Snow changed movement. Frontline medical personnel needed transport adapted to terrain. Sleds, skis, horses, dogs, and snow-capable vehicles all belonged to the practical vocabulary of survival. Even motorized snow vehicles, Soviet aerosans, were used in roles that included transport, liaison, supply, and medical evacuation, showing how deeply snow shaped movement on the front. But the cheap wooden sled remained different from a machine. It did not require production priority in the same way. It did not compete for engines. Could be improvised. It could appear in places where formal supply had not caught up. It could be built by men who understood wood better than medicine and used by medics who understood urgency better than engineering. That made it both valuable and easy to overlook. Institutions often recognize expensive things more clearly than cheap ones. A new vehicle demands records. A gun demands ammunition accounting. A tank has a serial number. A sled may be made, used, broken, repaired, and burned for firewood before anyone thinks to call it important. This proof was not in inventory. This proof was in men who reached aid alive. That kind of proof is difficult to preserve. A soldier saved by a sled might never know what saved him. He might remember only the sky moving above him, branches passing, the jolt of wood under his back, a voice telling him to keep quiet or keep breathing. Later, in hospital, he might remember the pain more than the tool. Years later, if he survived the war, he might remember snow. Not the sled itself. The rescuer remembered more. The rope, the weight, the way a body shifts when consciousness leaves it. The sound runners make when snow changes from powder to crust. But rescuers were not always the ones who wrote the official story. So the sled slipped into the background. It became part of the immense unnoticed machinery that keeps an army alive. Field kitchens, repair teams, laundries, veterinary services, railway crews, bridge builders, telephone linemen, grave registration teams, medical orderlies. The war could not function without them. Memory could. This is one reason the story matters. Not because the sled won the Eastern Front. It did not. Not because it was uniquely Soviet in every possible form. Other armies in winter used sledges and improvised transport too. It matters because it reveals a different scale of war. The scale at which victory is not a flag over a city, but one wounded man arriving before his pulse fades. The scale at which a rough tool can be more decisive than a perfect plan because the tool is present and the plan is not. What they believed was that the great machinery of war decided everything. What the snow revealed was that the machinery failed at the edges unless ordinary people found ways to close the gap. That gap is where the sled belonged. And once we see it there, the object changes. It is no longer just a village tool dragged into a military emergency. It becomes something stranger, A weapon that did not kill but still affected the battle. The weapon that did not kill. The sled killed no one. It did not fire. It did not explode. It did not penetrate armor or cut wire or bring down aircraft. It did not push an enemy line backward. It did not appear in the hands of a decorated assault unit moving through smoke. If war were only the story of destruction, the sled would not belong in it. But war is also the struggle to keep men functioning while destruction does its work. That is where the sled becomes harder to dismiss. A wounded soldier left in the snow is not only a medical loss. He is a moral fact witnessed by others. Men notice who is retrieved and who is not. They notice whether cries are answered. They notice whether the army has enough strength and discipline to recover its wounded under fire. That knowledge changes how men endure. No soldier wants to depend on rescue. Every soldier knows he might. A unit that believes its wounded will be abandoned carries a private despair into the next fight. A unit that sees medics return again and again, even with a cheap sled and no guarantee of success, sees something else. Not safety. There was no safety, but commitment. The sled was part of that commitment. It told men, without speeches, that the distance between the line and the aid post could still be crossed. It told them the system behind them might be battered, overwhelmed, short of supplies and late, but not absent. It told them that if they fell where wheels could not go, there was still a chance someone would come low through the snow. That chance mattered. It did not erase fear. It gave fear an answer. In this sense, the sled became part of combat power in a way that is easy to miss. Armies are not made only of weapons. They are made of recoverable human beings. A man treated quickly might return to duty later. A man who survived might strengthen the morale of those around him. A man who died under care rather than alone in the field left a different memory for his comrades. War reduces men constantly. It reduces them to manpower, casualties, replacements, effectives, non-effectives. The sled pushed back against that reduction in the simplest possible way. It treated the wounded body as something still worth moving. This is not sentimental. It is practical. Armies that cannot recover their wounded lose men faster, lose confidence faster, and leave suffering to accumulate at the front until it becomes another form of defeat. The Germans learned hard lessons from the Eastern Winter. So did the Soviets. So did every force that tried to move across frozen ground with wounded men behind it. The battlefield did not ask whether a method looked modern. It asked whether it worked. The sled worked because it accepted limits. It did not try to overpower the terrain, conform to it. It slid where wheels failed. It moved quietly where engines were dangerous. It carried one man because one man was enough of a burden. It did not promise miracles. It offered motion. There is humility in that kind of tool. Perhaps that is why it disappears so easily from grand narratives. We prefer the decisive machine, the dramatic assault, the brilliant commander, the turning point marked by fire. A sled asks us to look lower, closer to the ground, closer to the body. It asks us to notice a different kind of battle, the fight to keep the wounded from becoming the dead. And once we notice that, the title of weapon begins to feel less strange. A thing does not have to kill the enemy to fight the war. Sometimes it fights the cold. Sometimes it fights distance. Sometimes it fights the quiet assumption that a wounded man lying beyond reach is already lost. The wooden sled fought that assumption. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but often enough that the traces of it remain in photographs, accounts, and the logic of winter evacuation. And its legacy is not found in one famous moment. It is found in repetition, trip after trip, night after night, a runner mark in the snow, filled by new snow before morning, leading away from the field instead of toward a grave. What the snow taught. Snow teaches slowly, then all at once. At first, it is inconvenience. Boots are heavier, roads narrow, engines start reluctantly. Men stamp their feet and curse into scarves. Then the temperature falls, the snow deepens, the wind rises, and the inconvenience becomes law. The front changes its rules. Sound travels differently. Movement slows. Blood is easier to see and harder to treat. The wounded become harder to find in darkness and easier to lose to exposure. A weapon that worked yesterday may freeze today. A plan that made sense on firm ground may collapse under the weight of white silence. The Eastern Front taught many lessons in winter. Some were tactical, some logistical, some medical. All of them were paid for. One of the quiet lessons was that evacuation is not merely rear area work. It is a frontline operation. The act of saving a wounded man begins inside the same battlefield that wounded him. It requires tools fitted not to ideal conditions, but to the worst ground an army expects to cross. In a forest, that might mean poles and blankets. In mud, boards and carts. In mountains, ropes and pack animals. In snow, sleds. The wooden sled belongs to a larger truth about war. The environment is not background. It is an active force. It decides which equipment becomes useful, which habits become fatal, which assumptions break first. A commander might believe a unit's strength lies in rifles, machine guns, artillery support, and reserves. He would not be wrong. But a unit's strength also lies in whether it can absorb injury without disintegrating, whether it can pull its wounded back, whether its medical chain can begin before bodies freeze, whether adaptation happens fast enough to matter. The sled did not create that truth. It exposed it. There is a line connecting that winter tool to later ideas of terrain-specific evacuation and rapid casualty movement. We should be careful with that line. History rarely gives simple, direct inheritance. Modern casualty evacuation has its own technologies, doctrines, vehicles, aircraft, and medical systems. But the principle remains recognizable. The best evacuation method is the one that reaches the casualty in the conditions that actually exist. Not the conditions imagined in training. Not the conditions preferred by supply officers. The conditions under which a wounded man is waiting. That is why low-tech tools survive even in high-tech armies. A rope still matters. A litter still matters. A sled, a drag sheet, a toboggan, a pair of skis. These things persist because terrain can strip modern systems down to basic questions. Can you reach him? Can you move him? Can you keep him alive long enough for the next stage? The Red Army's winter sled answered those questions in a language older than modern war. Wood, rope, snow, hands. It is tempting to make the sled symbolic and stop there. But symbols can become too clean. The real sled was probably cracked, dirty, uncomfortable, and sometimes badly made. Caused pain as it saved life. Could not carry everyone. Could not stop artillery. Could not make a bad medical situation good. Its power was narrower. And because it was narrower, it was real. It solved the problem directly in front of it. That may be the deepest lesson the snow taught. In war, the solution that survives is not always the most advanced. It is the one that fits the moment so precisely that men keep using it even after no one needs to argue for it. A wounded man in the snow does not care whether a tool is modern. He cares whether it arrives. So we return now to the image where the story began. Not to celebrate the sled as a miracle, but to see it clearly. A small object at the edge of an enormous war, carrying the weight that history often leaves behind. A rope tightens. A runner shifts. The field is still dark. And somewhere, a man who should have been unreachable begins to move. The tracks left behind. By morning, the tracks were already fading. That is how snow treats evidence. It softens it first, then covers it. The deep grooves left by the sled runners became shallow lines. The boot marks beside them blurred. The dark places where men had stopped too long were dusted over by fresh white powder. The battlefield did not look clean. Nothing could make it clean, but it looked less specific. A man passing later might not know where the wounded had lain. He might not see where the rope had dragged across the ground, or where a rescuer had fallen, or where the sled had tipped and almost spilled its living cargo into a shell hole. He might only see a field between positions. War is full of places like that. Ground that holds everything for a few hours, then gives almost nothing back. The sled, too, might disappear. It might be pulled beside the aid post and used again before noon. It might break on the next trip. It might be repaired with wire. It might be abandoned during a retreat or burned for heat when there was nothing else dry enough to catch. No plaque would mark it. No crew would pose beside it like a tank. No official name would make it famous. Yet for the men it carried, it was not anonymous. Even if they never knew its story, they knew movement. They knew the moment the cold field began to slide beneath them. They knew the shape of sky through bare branches. They knew voices above them, hands holding them down when the sled lurched, someone telling them not to sleep. Some survived. Some did not. That has to be said plainly. No tool redeems war. The sled saved men, but it also carried men who were already beyond saving. It brought bodies back as well as the wounded. It gave doctors a chance, not certainty. It widened the margin, and the front still took many. But margins matter. In war, entire lives exist inside margins. A few minutes before shock deepens. A few meters before the machine gun can see. A few degrees before wet wool becomes a death sentence. A few hands willing to pull when everything in the body says stop. They believed the fate of wounded men was decided behind the lines, in aid stations, hospitals, ambulances, and surgical rooms. Those places mattered. They mattered enormously. But what really happened was that survival often began earlier, lower, and colder, at the edge of the battlefield, in the first frozen minutes after a man fell, when someone decided he was still worth reaching. That decision needed a tool. Sometimes the tool was a stretcher. Sometimes a blanket. Sometimes a horse cart, a dog team, skis, a truck, or an aerosan. And sometimes it was a cheap wooden sled. Rough boards. Rope. Runners under snow. It did not look like a turning point. It did not sound like victory. It moved with a scrape, a hiss, a drag, and the strained breathing of the person pulling it. But in the frozen dark of the Eastern Front, where theory broke against weather and men learned the difference between plans and survival, that was enough. They believed modern war belonged to steel, engines, guns, and maps. But what really happened was quieter. A man lived because wood could slide where wheels could not. A medic came back because the rope still held. And for a little while, before new snow covered everything, the proof was there on the ground. 2 narrow tracks leading away from death. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place where your family still carries memories of war, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, healed, carried, waited, or simply survived, you are welcome to leave their story there too. Warfront Archive is built for the forgotten edges of World War II, the moments where belief met reality, and ordinary people carried more than history remembered. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing those stories.